So the brief was quite simple, actually. The client wanted two main things. One was for the building to be small and self-sufficient, and the other requirement was that it would have to be raised above the ground, because the location where we built it is near the river, and we went through a number of design options. I think there was around 5, and the last most ambitious one was cantilever. It's something that I thought was a bit of a crazy idea, but let's throw it out there, the wild card, and that's the one the client liked, and that's what we proceeded with, and effectively it resulted in a building that is very small, but it has all the basics for working remotely or for staying and resting there. Basically, it's a very simple idea where there's a building on a leg of sorts that is as minimal as possible, and the main thing is to minimize the way it touches the ground to free up the space in the forest, lift it up as much as possible. The total height of the building is 9 meters. That's the maximum you can go under a certain fire regulation, but in theory, you could go higher and higher and higher up, so you get lifted more and more into the tree branches. And because of that, it's a modular design that can be adapted for any location, which I believe is quite exciting. And there's no real one source of inspiration. It's much more about the functionality, about the fact that it has to be made out of components that fit on a truck. And ultimately, I think the best kind of design is where there's no easy way of saying, oh, this was inspired by this and that. It's much more about people's imagination. I knew from the beginning that we would be building in a forest, so immediately my reaction was I have to work with the forest, not against it. And because it's in a pine forest, the prototype, the one we built, it felt natural to use pine wood, because why would you bring something else into the location? And luckily there is an Estonian company called Thermory, which sells wood, which is thermally treated and therefore becomes more durable, more maintenance-free, better at resisting rot and so on, and it felt natural to use that. So because it's in a pine forest, we used pine wood. And then for the terrace that's located underneath the cantilevering element, the sort of outside living room where you can put different chairs, decks and so on, things to sit on, it required another kind of wood, so it wouldn't be part of the kind of cantilevering L-shaped building. So in there we used ash, which also is provided by Thermory, and both effectively will be as maintenance-free as possible. The main part of the building will eventually become grey and fade into the forest even more, blend in, despite the geometry being quite striking. So it's going to be an interesting balance of it being made from the same wood as the forest around it, but completely man-made. The geometry is much more strict, much more kind of controlled. And so the contrast between the two will be interesting, and luckily for the client it will be as maintenance-free as possible, because you don't have to come and oil it every so often, or you don't have to come and paint it and so on. And then the other benefit was that there was a pattern dimension that was square in section, which is quite deep, deeper than you normally would use. Normally you would just use planks next to each other, no gaps and so on. Here, because there's a number of components in the building that require air to be taken in and out, because there's a window, but the window doesn't quite fit in the geometry and so on, it's allowed effectively to use a hit and miss batten approach, where there's a piece of wood, gap, piece of wood, gap. Because of that, it allows to conceal all the different technical requirements, and the building itself looks monolithic and simple. And on the other hand, as the sun moves around the building at different times of day, it casts shadows, which are quite deep, quite intriguing, and it adds a layer of depth and dimensionality to the building, which from a simple shape gives it some kind of definition. It doesn't need any other decoration. The sun and the wood together simply create the geometry, and that's kind of what this project is about. I think the main challenge when designing the building was to make it modular. That was both the challenge, but also kind of the best thing about this, because it can be made in a factory completely off-site, where the body is one component, the sort of leg is another component, and then you have the terrace, the glass, and so on that get bolted on. The challenge was to make it fit with the dimensions of what you can transport without any special permissions or requirements. And effectively, that was the driving factor of the design. So once I knew the size of effectively the maximum dimensions that I could work with, I tried to make the inside work in the best way possible using those dimensions. And it's quite interesting because normally I work with significantly bigger projects, and this was the opposite. You had to think small, how to make every element have several functions. So for example, inside there, the bed becomes the desk, becomes the kitchenette. Then you have a place to locate your books and personal possessions. That becomes the staircase. So in a very small space, it's about fitting in different requirements and allowing the user to see how they use the building themselves, but giving different surfaces that can be used in different ways, like a seat, like a table, and so on. And because the space is so constrained, that becomes the challenge. That becomes the interesting challenge of how you can fit different functions into a very compact space. And it was exciting while designing those really big structures in London to also speak with the joiner about how we connect those two details and how we make it precise, how we kind of celebrate wood inside. So as a designer, it was an interesting contrast, and working within the dimensions of what can be transported in one piece was the other kind of interesting challenge, which I think ultimately, if this building was to be mass produced, would be the benefit, because you can make a bunch of them in a factory where it's nice and warm inside. You don't have to worry about rain, about people having to work in a forest in the middle of nowhere and so on. And then you just transport it to a beautiful location and you bolt it all together. It's done. And then eventually, if you want to move the building somewhere else, you can equally come back and unbolt it, take it apart, and take it somewhere else. So it's a bit more like product design than typical architecture, where you come and you build it for a year and so on. And I think that this modular approach generally is the direction in which architecture should be moving more. So it was good to try out something quite unique like that myself.